The second answer to the question of why care for Israel, which is for his sake, it's actually for God's sake, to honor the ways that God chose to bring redemption to this world in the Israel way. His ways being so much higher than our ways, his thoughts so much higher, in choosing to reveal himself through these particular people and to reveal his heart and his character through the way he would deal with them, and all at such cost to himself to bring redemption to the world in the Israel way. And this was all about calling a very particular people in a very particular way and for a very particular purpose, which was for them to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, to whom he then revealed himself and also reveal himself through, which he made possible, as we've been thinking about, by giving them an everlasting covenant. So whatever responses they would then make, they would be kept within it, whilst using their responses to give to the world this continuing revelation of himself, and to which the world then had the option to respond in whatever way it would. God knowing, and there we go into the sovereignty of God again, the cost that this would bring to him through the likely response of the world in general, and even the response of these very particular people he chose, about whom the Lord said, I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now, have any of you ever had a stiff neck? None of you? Well, one or two nods. Well, it can't be too bad if you're nodding. But if you've got a stiff neck, it's an extraordinary thing, because you can't, we look around without thinking. If you have a stiff neck, you have to turn your whole body. We become very unturnable. And God chose these unturnable people for his purposes. We are back into the sovereignty of God. And this had mega implications for God, as we've been thinking about these verses from Isaiah 43, where God says, I, even I, am he who blots out your transgressions for my own sake. This is the essence of how God chose to bring redemption to the world, the Israel way. And it's reflected many ways in Scripture. The psalmist saying, they did not remember the multitude of your mercies, but rebelled by the sea, the Red Sea. And yet at the same time, the psalmist then sees how crucial Israel was in God's purposes, going on to say, nevertheless, he saved them for his name's sake, that he might make his mighty power known. Just that one verse is enough to think about for a very long while, about God's choice of Israel and his use of Israel. This is what God in his sovereignty chose to do. And it meant that whatever questions you and I have, and we live in this world of soundbite knockdown answers. This is what we are fed all day in the media, soundbites, knockdown answers. But we are taken into seeking to understand how intentional it was in God's purposes, even though we may not easily understand it, that he would give a continuing revelation of himself, of his heart and his character through doing it like this. So those who would have eyes to see it would have a greater context for the finished work of salvation that he would do at one very particular point in time. It was to give this great backcloth so that we would then better understand what he did at that very particular point in time. And whilst the significance of this greater context, which is there to be seen for those who have eyes to see it, but unable to be seen by those who don't want to see it, the one who did very clearly see it was the devil. The devil saw that in the way that God chose to bring redemption to the world, the Israel way posed to him the most enormous threat. And it was this threat that God would reveal his heart and his character and what all that was about through it, that caused the devil to then seek to totally eliminate Israel, and to do so in a way that started way back in Scripture, if you think going back as far as the time of Haman, this plan to get Israel physically eliminated, and continues through to this very day, as we are still seeing now all this time, over 500 days after October the 7th. This continued endeavor to totally eliminate Israel so that the world could then not see God's purposes in choosing to bring redemption to the world the Israel way. We do not know what would have happened 15 months ago if Hezbollah had also attacked at the same time. And we go into an area even before our eyes of not being able to understand the complexities of the dynamics between what God is permitting and what God does not permit. Right now, we are actually, though we watch it just on our regular screens, watching an expression of God's sovereignty that goes beyond our simple knockdown ability to give easy answers to. All we do know is that this threat, which the devil saw way back in the time of Haman, is applying today through Hamas. And from the devil's viewpoint, that threat has never diminished. Actually, the threat from the devil's viewpoint has not diminished. It is going up and up and up. So we are living in these times where we see Haman, Hamas, Hezbollah, and all the others physically trying to eliminate Israel. And we see the symbol of this as this very particular flag. But what happened in the course of all this story forwards from the devil first seeing the threat back then was another symbol that came into play 2,000 years ago, the symbol of the cross. And when the devil then saw that, this heightened the threat level in a way that took it into another category entirely. Because evidently the devil realized he could never, ever disempower what had happened through the cross. The death and the resurrection of the Messiah is something he could never, ever reverse. But what he did realize he could do was, whilst he could never remove that, he could try to spiritually eliminate the picture of Israel from the eyes of the church. He then got himself a double assignment: the physical elimination of Israel from the eyes of the world, and the spiritual elimination of Israel from the eyes of the believers. And he had himself a challenge to think, how could he do this? How could this ever be brought about, that the spiritual significance of Israel could be eliminated? And he clearly realized somehow back in the day that if he could ever sever the Jewish roots of the Christian faith from Israel, that those who went on in the light of the cross, about which he could do nothing about, would still be, at least to some extent, disempowered. They would not have the fullness of the roots, or at least the understanding of it. And so his challenge was, how could the roots of the Christian faith be severed? Now, evidently, he became extremely determined to do this. And if we want to understand what was really driving the devil and the extent of his determination, where we see this both pictured most acutely is in Isaiah 14, and in what was driving the devil to attempt to usurp the picture of God, the power of God on the throne. And you may well know these words in the way the devil is pictured as saying, and these are things obviously way beyond our understanding, but here it is in essence, the devil saying, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. This is the devil being driven by this desire to usurp the picture of God. This was the power of the driving force that the devil had. And it was all because of his envy of the position of God. He was apparently an archangel with great glory, but this was still not enough for him. He desperately wanted to have the glory that God alone had had. His envy being driven by pride, thinking that he actually had the power to lift himself up into that position. And all of this, for want of a more theological word, was bonkers. I've never found a better theological word for it, but there we are, bonkers to think he could do that. But such was the driving force. He actually did think he could. And what the devil never ever could do, though, in the face of all this, was to have the position of God. And we know how God responded, saying, I am the Lord. This is my name. I will not yield my glory to another. God's name being, as it were, the picture, and you need to be probably a bit closer to see all of that, but in so many ways is a picture of all the attributes of God that can be described about his nature. And when we use the name of God, it's like this banner headline for everything that we can put under it. And there is a multiplicity of ways this can be done. And it pictures what God, in the face of what the devil had sought to do, to usurp that, then chose to do in response. And his response was to redeem the world in the Israel way. And he chose this nation, this very particular nation, who never, to be fair to them, ever sought the position and never even claimed that they deserved it. But he chose them in his sovereignty, that not only would they be then called by his name, all that great banner headlines, these people would be called by his name. He would then put his glory on them. This was his counterpoint. The devil's trying to grab God's glory. God is saying, I will not give it to any others. Not on the basis of being forced, but if I choose to get my glory, I still will. And to demonstrate the extent of how much I desire to give my glory, I'm going to choose a very, very particular people to do this with. Not the largest number of people, just a very small group. Not the easiest of people, the most difficult of people. I'm not even going to ask them. I'm just going to give it to them, even though they don't deserve it. And whatever their response is afterwards, saying, we don't want it, I'm going to still keep my glory on them. This was his response to the devil seeking to usurp that glory. And so he calls these people, who he's going to call them by his name, using them to give human lineage to the one to send the Messiah through, and to do all this to rebut the devil's strategy to try and get the glory of God. And we know the story of how he first puts it on these people with this at Sinai, this overwhelming picture of the glory. They are overwhelmed by glory, causing them to shake and tremble, and then saying to you, and I know you haven't asked for it, I know you don't deserve it, but you will be a kingdom of priests, you will be a holy nation, and I will complete it. 500 years later, when Solomon's temple, when the glory of God again comes down, the glory fills the temple so much that the priests can't even enter into it. God, 500 years on, after all the stuff they've done, and you know the amount of stories, they were not entirely honoring to God. They've done 500 years of this, and at the end of 500 years of this, what God is still saying is, if my people who are called by my name would only just please humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear, still unconditional promise, I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. God's still saying this. After 500 years of all the stuff they've done, he is still saying that, showing how God had never given up on Israel. He was still speaking them as his chosen people. He still wanted to forgive them personally. He still wanted to heal their land, meaning when we talk about the healing of their land, not just the physical earth, but the redemption of everything that constitutes Israel's identity at every level, through which he display his faithfulness. And then, as we know how the story goes on, the possibility of all this being transformed by the coming of Messiah Yeshua, who takes on the identity of the temple that Solomon had physically built. He takes on the identity of the temple, and Messiah Yeshua then declares, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I'll raise it up. And what he then does is fulfill each of the conditions that God had given to Solomon for the forgiveness of their sins and the healing of their land. The first condition being to humble themselves. And of course, Yeshua humbles himself, that picture in Philippians chapter 2, at a level that it goes beyond anything we can ever understand about. He did not count equality with God something to be equal to, takes the form of a servant, the perfect servant, being born in the likeness of men, becoming obedient even to death on the cross. Then, next requirement, if only his people would pray, well, he could never pray more powerfully than these words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they've done. The next requirement, to turn from their wicked ways, he then literally became sin on their part. He didn't just forgive their sin, he took their sin onto himself so that it would be removed as far as the east is from the west. And this made possible then, having fulfilled those conditions, the healing of their land, the healing of their total identity. And it was this that the first believers evidently grasped very quickly, because as we know, they were quickly called the people who turned the world upside down. They'd had this personal experience themselves of discovering how their hearts of stone had been turned to hearts of flesh. And as they saw what had been prophesied in Ezekiel 36 about this, this brought alive to them that this giving of this new spirit, the gaining of the heart of flesh, if that had happened in Ezekiel 36, that part, just possibly the other parts of the prophecy that precede that and follow it were also true. Because they discovered that God was no longer on the outside, he was now on the inside. He was alive, and this then validated what goes on in Ezekiel 36, begins in verse 22. This is what the sovereign Lord says. It is not for your sake, people of Israel. You start to get these familiar lines. It is not for your sake, the Lord says. It's not for your sake, people of Israel, I'm doing these things, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned amongst the nations. Again, no soft touch about how God sees Israel. He's still saying, you're called by my name, even though you profaned it. This is the power of God's relationship with Israel. You've profaned it amongst the nations, you've gone. But these uncompromising words had actually been said when they were in captivity in Babylon, which was like about halfway between Solomon's time and where the believers were. And as the first believers saw, our hearts have been made alive. And here's this prophecy back in Ezekiel, which describes even the Israel of today. And then if you go to the other side of the words about a new heart and being turned from a stone to flesh to the other side of the Ezekiel 36 prophecy, then we find the promise which follows of these words. They will say, this land that was laid waste has become like the Garden of Eden. The cities that were lying in ruins, desolate and destroyed, are now fortified and inhabited. And this was yet another prophetic picture of the healing of their land. And so then they would presumably something about the other of their scriptures that also speak, like Isaiah 61. They will rebuild the ancient ruins, restore the places long devastated. They'll renew the ruined cities. They've been devastated for generations. Instead of your shame, you'll receive a double portion. Instead of disgrace, you'll rejoice in your inheritance. You'll inherit a double portion in your land. Everlasting joy will be yours. Other prophecies like Zechariah 8 that speak about the end time restoration of Jerusalem. Chapter 14 about how after the return of the Lord, the Messiah will enter Jerusalem, will take up his reign and his rule. Whereupon the Lord will be king over the whole earth. And on that day, there will only be one Lord and his name, the only name. Now, they must have been full of questions about however can all this possibly happen? But what was absolutely clear to them? However many questions we've got about us, if we have experienced this turning around of us, bringing us alive, one thing is clear. God has not finished with Israel. We don't know how all this can be worked out, but this most extraordinary thing just happened to us and which we cannot dispute. We know it's real. What it says, these end-time prophecies, who knows how, where, and when, but one thing is clear. God has not finished with Israel. Now, they get hold of this. That's what so galvanizes them. And this explains why the threat level to the devil then went sky high. The devil could see that if they got hold of this truth, and if this truth were to spread to all who would then find salvation through the one who died on the cross and was raised, this would not only, from the devil's angle, block all his attempts to desecrate the world, but they would then eventually, as they follow the story, begin to see why God chose to bring redemption the Israel way, which was to rebut the way the devil had sought to usurp God's glory. And that would expose him totally. So in the midst of this, as the devil saw how the threat level had gone so high, we then see, to understand how threatening he found it, why he then sought to perpetrate what we've called the great deception that would set about making the church believe that God had actually finished with Israel. And so his goal was to eliminate Israel from the sight of the church, and to help us really get the feel of just how intense and tenacious was his strategy in doing all this, in perpetrating the great deception. What I'm going to quickly run through with you is the use of the three sort of classic detective things. Whenever you watch detective things on television, one of the classic things that they're always doing is when they try and sort out a crime, they think about what was the motive, what was the means, and was it the opportunity? And actually this works very well. If you think that the great deception was the greatest of crimes, let's use those three just to follow through what happened. And what we know is where the motive began was for the devil to remove the threat so that the church would never, ever see what God had actually done in bringing redemption the Israel way. Of Acts, first of all, he set about physical attack of them. That really backfired because the believers were scattered and the gospel got spread. And so what it meant was that he had to find another means. So from a detective perspective, we can then see how he switched from physical attack to spiritual attack. In contrast to physical attack, which is blatant and brutal, this would be supple and stealthy. It would be scarcely seen for what it was. And the way it would work would be by targeting the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. The whole aim of the devil being to get the Messiah's followers to conclude that whatever God's past use of Israel, he'd now no further purpose for Israel. His hope being that they would then think, well, if God has finished with Israel, we don't need any more connection with Israel. The Jewish roots of the faith are irrelevant. And in that way, the whole understanding of Israel will become lost on them. And they would think, we don't need the roots, do we? Let's just cut them off. I mean, if you've got a plant where bits of it are dead, the obvious thing is you just cut them off, don't you? And that was the sort of thinking. Get them to think we just don't need this anymore. But if we go on with our detective perspective, what we then can realize is what the massive dilemma was for the devil in this. How would he get them to that point to make all those conclusions? He had no way to sever the roots himself. All he could do is get the believers to that point, and they would have to be lured into thinking that this was the thing they should do. And so his realization was that it would take nothing less than getting the church to think it was the new Israel. There's the answer. If they think they're the new Israel, then that fixes the whole thing. However, then we have to think about, well, however did he get them to think it was the new Israel? And if we use our detective perspective, it's not too hard to think that he would have gone back to that strategy he used in the Garden of Eden to cause Adam and Eve to lose their life in Eden, hoping that that one little question will get them to lose the believers to lose their life in Messiah Yeshua. And so all he had to do was to take this same question and say, did God really say he still got any purpose for Israel? Hoping that as they saw this, they'd then say no, and the whole thing would happen. But he would still have to have his opportunity for how he would do this. And that, as we see from church history, then involved a great deal of tenacity. Because when he first went round with the first believers saying, did God really say he has an ongoing purpose to Israel? The answer he got was, yes, because they'd seen it. They did not know how it would work, but the first believers were all Jewish. And as far as they were concerned, it was clear God had not finished with Israel. And he got clobbered. He made little progress at first. And what became very clear was that he would have to wait until the church was no longer just Jewish, but started to become Gentile. Because the Gentile believers didn't have that sense of history and of the prophecies of Scripture in the way that the Jews had. The Jewish believers, it's etched into their very fabric. The Gentile believers, it's just something you read. And he knew that he was going to have to wait until he'd get an opportunity with Gentile believers. And so he had, as we're going to see, had to wait almost 300 years to get his opportunity that would be big enough. But just for the sake of the record, it's interesting to note that actually there were hints of this much, much earlier. Indeed, if you think of the book of Romans, and why did Paul write Romans 9 to 11, means that he must have got some whiff of this already happening. That this was something he felt needed to be stamped on, that there were believers there in the church in Rome who were already beginning to think the church had become the new Israel, and something that Paul wrote the whole of the Epistle of the Romans just to do chapters 9 to 11 to, as we'll be thinking about this afternoon, to include the olive tree analogy. But even if that's a little bit speculative, what we do know, here is a quote from Ignatius, Bishop of Israel, and around the year 100, not so far, and so if we are still practicing Judaism, we admit that we've not received God's favor. It's wrong to talk about Jesus Christ and live like a Jew. Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity. Here's another one from the theologian Origen, who in the early 200s said, we may thus assert in utter confidence that the Jews will not return to their earlier situation, for they've committed the most abominable of crimes. This is Origen, the great theologian. They've committed the most abominable of crimes, forming this conspiracy against the Savior of the human race. Hence the city where Jesus suffered was necessarily destroyed. The Jewish nation was driven from its country, and another people was called by God to the blessed election. So this is what he was saying even around that year. But it was not until around AD 315 when the devil began to see the size of opportunity that he was really looking for. And this all happened through the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine. And whilst the authenticity of this conversion has been long debated, what is indisputable is how consequential Constantine then became for the advance of Christianity, because he declared the whole Roman Empire to be Christian. And the reasons for that are also much debated. But what is clear is the opportunity the devil saw it to bring about the severing of the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. And again, with our detective perspective, it's not too hard to imagine the devil whispering in the Constantine ears, did he really say that God had any ongoing purpose for Israel? Because if not, wouldn't Christianity spread so much more easily if it didn't have a Jewish root? And you could just imagine that whispering in his ear. Now, Constantine almost certainly would have known that there were theologians for a long while who'd been saying something like that. We also know that Constantine did not like the Jews. And so he then officially severed Christianity from its Jewish roots, made the declaration. And for most of the believers, the likelihood is that it didn't mean anything much. And the only people who did spot what it was all about was if you were Jewish and you wanted to join the church, you were then required to renounce everything Jewish you'd ever been involved with. And for those believers, it probably did give the game away. But for the rest, it was all about really apparently simple things. So
just meant replacing Shabbat with Sunday and Passover with Easter, replacing Jerusalem with Rome, and Hebrew names with Greek names, so Yeshua became Jesus, Messiah with Christ. And, if that was the price of the whole Roman Empire becoming Christian, I mean, that's not too big a price, is it? You can sort of see the way it would have worked. Whilst what actually happened was that the very essence of Christianity that would then be spread through the whole Roman Empire and which would roll on from then was intrinsically changed, because in the most subtle of ways, the inference was, so the church has become the new Israel. And this really set in concrete, and yes, they did have a form of concrete about 10 years later, back in AD 325, in a little place called Nicaea, just about 40 miles from the city that had been called Constantinople by then, today's Istanbul, when Constantine called together 200 bishops to form the first so-called Great Ecumenical Council of the Church. And it was ostensibly all about them resolving their theological debate about the Trinity. That's what it was all supposed to be about. But in this, the devil then saw his great opportunity, because what they did was such an incredibly good job of Christian doctrine, as you may well know, that the Nicene Creed they wrote in AD 325 is 1700 years on this year, still widely quoted as the gold standard of Christian doctrine. And if any of you have ever done any study, it is incredibly good stuff they actually did. There's so much of it is excellent, excellent teaching. There's just one catch with the whole thing, which is that it makes no reference to Israel whatsoever. And this could have been done with just one extra phrase. That's all it took. One extra phrase would have fixed it. But that one extra phrase was not in there. And so what it said was, by implication, you can have all this gold standard doctrine without any reference to Israel. This was the catch of the Nicene Creed, which was carried on through to this day. What was actually the first council of the church actually happened in Acts 15. And then it was all about the Jewish believers seeing how the Gentiles could be brought in. Then, at Nicaea, it's all about the Gentiles seeing how the Jews could be kept out. This was the extreme contrast. And this point was the watershed of the church's view of Israel, which was achieved without apparently ever making it a creedal statement. This is the subtlety of the deception. Amongst all these creedal statements, that's never made as a creedal statement. It just happens by omission and by inference that the church had completely taken over the role that Israel had in God's purposes. Must therefore be the new Israel. Must therefore get everything from God directly. And it was this that led the church into a false understanding of this identity, into a mistaken understanding of his relationship with God, into a vulnerability to swallowing all sorts of other lies. And the consequence went even further than this, because the church then did not give another thought to the ongoing significance of Israel. And this was the launch point for the strategy that the devil has perpetrated this last 1700 years to insidiously promote what is now known as replacement theology, doing so by stealth, by omission, and by inference. That is what has happened through church history for 1700 years. Stealth is what's used in battles to catch the enemy unawares, or it's used in a scam so the victim doesn't realize they've been caught. Omission is about influence to what's not said rather than what is said that makes it so subtle. And inference is all about getting the hero to conclude things for themselves, which is not actually based on fact. And this whole thing then picked up momentum, because following Nicaea, over the next 50 to 100 years, it's theologians who became known as the church fathers. They were like the influencers of their day, expanded, what Nicaea laid the foundation for, most notably through Augustine. You may well know the name of Augustine. He wrote his famous book, The City of God, and he expressed much hatred for the Jewish people. Now, Augustine is held up very prominently as a great theologian. But you need to know, if you don't know already, that Augustine said terrible things about the Jewish people. Here's one of his quotes. This is from Augustine. The Jews were sons of God, but now they are sons of Satan. The true image of the Hebrews is Judas Iscariot, who sells the Lord for silver. The Jew can never understand the scriptures and will forever bear the guilt of Jesus. That is Augustine. One from Chrysostom, because God hates the Jews, it's the duty of Christians to hate them. Many I know respect the Jews and think their present way of life a venerable one. This is why I hasten to uproot and tear down this terrible opinion. The synagogue is not only a brothel and a theatre, it's also a den of robbers and lodging for one beast. When God forsakes a people, what hope of salvation is left? When God forsakes a place, that place becomes the dwelling of demons. Here's another from Hilary, Bishop of Poitiers. The Jews are a perverse people, accursed by God forever. Now, these church fathers were the influence of their day, and though their sort of pronouncements, it just resulted from the church and the believers who then grew, never having any place for Israel in their thinking. And the consequence on what was then the church was that it no longer then had the Jewish roots as its anchor point, let alone the life it would have drawn from them. And the consequence was it got drawn increasingly into religiosity, and the societies that it should have been salt and light in were then impoverished of all that. And what resulted was the Dark Ages that lasted for something like 1,000 years. Now, there were still many great saints who did live during that period, and not to lose sight of that. But the broader consequence was a spiritual darkness that followed from the church fathers for something like 1,000 years, religiosity taking over, Bible no longer in the hands of everyday people. They become dependent on the church. The church then exploits the power it gives them, and the Jew hatred, now known as anti-Semitism, gets multiplied and becomes entrenched. And all because it offers a very convenient dumping ground for all their own problems in life. Dump it all on the Jews. And to the devil, this must have looked like job done. Job done. You can imagine the devil over the years rejoicing. Israel is eliminated from their thinking. The believers have lost sight of the cross. I have won. And so it appeared until one day in the year 1517, through the conversion of Martin Luther, who rediscovered that it is by grace that you've been saved by faith, transformed his life and opened his eyes to how the church were exploiting the religious power of the people. You know the story, famously posts his 95 Theses on the cross in church door in Wittenberg. That was the way in those days to get the debate rolling, little realizing that what it would result in was the 16th century Reformation, and little realizing himself of the DNA of the Protestant church that he was forming, how it would actually go on through the next 500 years. But all of this, the devil is seeing the threat level going back up. The threat that the devil, thinking he'd remove the understanding of Israel, potentially was there, because if people start to get hold of the Bible again, and they are being transformed in their lives, the risk exposure is that they are sooner or later going to rediscover that God had not finished with Israel. And you can see from the devil's angle that the threat level had gone up. And the result of this was that in the midst of all this, in the midst of all these communities that are now being changed because lives were being changed, even European society was being changed, printing press was sending out printed Bibles, printed teaching leaflets, and the devil could see the risk exposure that people would sooner or later rediscover all about Israel. And it's not hard to imagine how he would have then sought to rejig his whole great deception. Surely that's the obvious thing he would do. And if we use our detective perspective, it's not hard then to read into what then happened, because the devil did indeed find a whole new opportunity to relaunch the great deception. And the clue to it is in the way that Martin Luther and also the other great reformer John Calvin, in everything they wrote, there was absolutely, guess what? No reference to Israel. In other words, all this incredible stuff where people no longer had to go to the priest to get forgiven. They didn't have to pay their penances. They were discovering their hearts were being turned from stone to flesh. Lives really were changing. And so the message was, you can have all this without any reference to Israel. And so the implication was the gospel was complete if you just understood it, simply applying to yourself. This is how it seemed. What we now today understand as what was the personal gospel was really has its roots in this message, because lives were being changed, and this appeared that this was the entire complete package. And of course, people of those days would have no real reason, unless they dug into scripture, to go looking for it. And the Reformation that is looked back to as in its day seeming so complete was actually seriously incomplete, because it totally lacked any reference to Israel. Again, just like in Nicaea, by subtlety, by omission, and by inference. And the reality of this began to be seen. I've actually spent about 11 years pastoring in a church in Geneva and know a little bit of the story of what then happened in the city of Reformation, which had been so used to impact society around it. But about 100 years or so later came what's known as the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, all about the thinking of the mind, rationalism, that have brought so many scientific advances and reduces everything about thinking. If it wasn't the thinking of the mind, all of the thinking was then separate, lower. So anything to do with faith, that was subordinated to the thinking of the mind. The church didn't have a leg to stand on. And this church, which 100 years earlier had been the time of the great height of this transformed city and the great sort of presence, it seemed, of the kingdom of God there, actually went down the drain at a phenomenal rate. And the reason was that with the Enlightenment, which talks all about rationalism and all about what in a sense is the truth that you can just sort of prove for yourself, it led to the church then feeling we can't keep up with this. So the church then started catching up with what became known as today relative truth. And the church of the Reformation very soon was trying to play catch up with the world. And when the church had been changing the world, it was the world that was changing the church. And it was only a short time later. And this surely would not have happened had the church had the inclusion of understanding the greater context of Israel, because they would have been hooked back to what was known as Torah. Torah only speaks of absolute truth. Torah doesn't allow for relative truth. And because the church didn't have its Jewish roots, it then got onto a very, very slippery slope. And so this was the church, and it was finding itself going down the chute at a very, very rapid rate. Now, big question, how did the devil pull it off? How did he manage to get the reformers to not make any reference to Israel? And what we can see in the way he did this, what would look like a very difficult question again to the devil, just go back to what they did. The reformers, when they saw people's lives being so dramatically changed, very understandably felt they had to rebuild the Christian faith. They had to build some basis of theology. It was all totally lost. So this is what they had to do. But instead of going back to the first believers, who had become so clear that God had not finished with Israel, what did they do? They went back to, guess who? 4th or 5th century church fathers, Augustine and the likes. They only went back that far. So they then based all their teaching on things like when Calvin wrote his great Institutes of the Christian Religion, gave all that teaching. If you look in the index, which you can now do, what you find is there's so many references that go back to Augustine. Now, people built theology that's come down to the church today and shaped so much on things like, so what did the Reformers say? What the Reformers were saying was, well, what did the church fathers say? And so it's been passed all through history, right down to us, this essence of what is now known as replacement theology. If you want a quick proof of this, Calvin's commentary on, so all Israel shall be saved, you'd think he would say what? Well, here's his answer. The Israel of God is what Paul calls the church. That's what Calvin said. Calvin, the great reformer. He also said their rotten and unbending stiff-neckedness deserves that they be oppressed unendingly and without measure or end, and they die in their misery without the pity of anyone. So that's the position of the Calvin. His writings greatly shaped the Protestant church. Luther, just very quickly, he began very much more favorably to the Jewish people, hoping the Jews would come over to us, although that's still a very replacement theology piece of thinking. But when they did not, Luther himself turned violently against the Jews. He wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lives, and in it he wrote, burn their synagogues and schools. What will not burn, bury it with earth, that neither stone nor rubbish remain, for in them there is nothing but godlessness, lies, cursing and swearing. Forbid their rabbis to teach on pain of life or limb, and it may be no coincidence that Luther died 3 years after that book was published. But this is what came down to us from the Reformers. And the message of the Reformation was basically this. However much else is being changed by the rediscovery of the gospel of salvation, the one thing it's not changing is our attitude to the Jews. The Jews, as far as they were concerned, had no more place within this. The Reformers felt okay about it. And the only explanation is that the devil managed to perpetrate this same lie. Did God really say he still wants any further purpose to Israel? Same lie he said to Constantine, same lie he said to the church fathers, same lie that he said to the Reformers, same lie that he is saying to the church today. Exactly the same, with subtlety, with omission, and with inference. And the impact, if you want to see it on today's church, is simply to say, what happened on October the 6th? Over 7th, I should say. What was the reaction of the church? Indifference. As far as much of the church were concerned, what's happened to the nation of Israel is no worse than what would happen to any other nation. And then, since then, and you might say is even more disturbing, is the response of the church as the world, first of all, is with Israel and then so quickly turns against Israel. What does the church do? Exactly the same. Exactly the same. So here's this thread which runs all the way through history, which is all the product of the devil's sense of threat that the church would ever discover the significance of its church rules. So, bottom line in all this, if that is the threat the devil feels, and which he manifestly feels to this day, let's just turn that round the other way. If that is the threat, what is the opportunity that we have in our time that the devil is seeing, but which the bulk of the church can't even see in any shape or form? If the devil is so threatened, it means that there is live opportunity for us today if we get hold of this truth. If we can take hold of it, and like those first believers, when the devil says to them, does God have any ongoing purpose for Israel? And they say yes, the devil was totally blocked. So what is the opportunity that the church today has if it were to say yes to the way God has chosen to bring redemption? Just how could be the transformation of this into this? If the church were to care for Israel, how greatly would the consequence be for the believers who are directly involved? How great will be the consequence for the church, that would move from dysfunctionality and to its distance from God, how great would be the consequence? And if the church were to be changed in that way, how great would be the consequence for our nation, or the consequence for Israel, if in some way God's people start to treasure Israel in the way he treasures Israel? What would it mean for us, for them? And what honor would it bring to the God of Israel, who at such cost to himself chose in his sovereignty to bring redemption to Israel? What difference would it make? Potentially we have opportunity in our time, at our generation, through the revelation we are getting, which exceeds things the previous generations did not have. Just how great is that opportunity to bring honor to God for the way he chose to redeem the world, the Israel way?